Excellent. Good morning, good afternoon, or evening to all of you joining us, and welcome to today's World Green Building Week 2024 webinar on reducing whole life carbon emissions in the built environment. My name is Matthew Black. I am the Climate Action Manager at the World Green Building Council, and I will be moderating today's session. Before we get started, I'd like to briefly introduce the World Green Building Council for those of you who may not be familiar with the organization. World GBC is the largest local to regional to global action network accelerating sustainability in the built environment. At World GBC, our role is to help the property and construction sector around the world to reach tipping points towards decarbonisation and regeneration. That means building the right policy environments, the right finance environments, and crucially, the right social and cultural environments to deliver a more resilient and sustainable planet. Our unique local, regional, and global network helps us to catalyze these waves of change that ripple across cities, countries, companies, and communities. By amplifying the leadership of our members and our partners, we are building on their successes and scaling local action into global impact. Today, we all know that buildings and the related activities are responsible for nearly 40% of all carbon emissions. With our network, we believe that we have both the scale and the shared ambition to target total decarbonisation of the sector by 2050. World GBC's vision is for resilient and decarbonised buildings for a healthy planet and a better future for all. And our mission is to inspire and lead the built environment community to drive this local action and create the global momentum necessary for both people and planet to thrive. So whilst the path to sustainability can seem complex, what matters is that we are all taking steps in the right direction, and together we're building momentum to create a better future for all. And that's exactly what you're all doing today by joining us this World Green Building Week under the theme of Building the Transition. We are calling on everyone to follow these steps for a better future. And as you may recognize, we are carrying on the theme from last year, Building the Transition, with a new strapline this year, set very simply to clarify what we need to achieve. We need to reduce, we need to electrify, and we need to adapt. Next slide, please. So as we've noted, the first step is to reduce the amount of energy and resources that we use. The built environment currently consumes around 34% of global energy and around half of all raw materials. We know that from the IEA's Net Zero 2050 scenario, that energy efficiency and electrification are the two most impactful reduction measures for the built environment to deliver the emissions reductions that we need to see. But we can't ignore embodied carbon, and therefore a whole life carbon approach is crucial. By improving our energy efficiency and minimizing the materials that we use, our sector can dramatically decrease global energy and resource demands. So today in our session, we're going to hear from three fantastic speakers on how their businesses are building the transition by significantly reducing their energy and resource consumption and leading to a sustainable reduction in whole life carbon emissions. So our fantastic panelists today include Eleanor Huggett. She is the Global Real Estate Sustainability Leader at Deloitte. We have Sophia Key, Head of Future Ready at WSP in the Middle East. And we have Tessa Brunette, Associate Director at Arup. And in a short moment, each of our speakers we're going to go to in turn to introduce themselves and tell us more about their business's efforts to decarbonize before we come back to a more in-depth panel discussion. So without any further ado from me, I'm delighted to hand over to Eleanor to kick us off and tell us about Deloitte's efforts in reducing carbon emissions from the built environment. Thank you, Eleanor.
Thanks very much, Matt, and great introduction. Thanks very much for having me. Really, really good to be here today with such a brilliant panel. And as always, joining a World Green Building Council event is always a pleasure. So hopefully I'll say some things which are interesting and hopefully spark some thoughts from you all for questions and discussion once we get to that stage. So I'm assuming that all of you have heard of Deloitte. I hope that's a fairly safe assumption, but I did want to start with a little bit of context about Deloitte. So we are a global professional services network and we have almost 500,000 people worldwide. So really, really significant organization. And those people mean obviously that we need a lot of office space. And so we have just over 3 million square meters of office space globally. Almost all of that space is leased, so we own very little of our property globally. We lease the majority of it. In fact, we own 3 buildings globally, and all of our other offices are in leased spaces. Obviously, there's some nuance to that, but I won't go into it. And my role is internal. As Matt said, I'm the global real estate sustainability lead at Deloitte. So my job is about taking our public climate commitments that we have made, and you can see on our website, and translating them into what does that mean for the offices which we occupy. So in terms of the relevant goals, which kind of I have to think about, we've set some really challenging near-term net zero targets, including a reduction in scopes 1 and 2 of 70% by 2030 against the 2019 baseline, a commitment to use 100% renewable electricity by 2030. We've also signed the World Green Building Council's Net Zero Buildings Commitment, which commits us to no longer have buildings with fossil fuel systems in them by 2030. And we've committed to significantly reduce our embodied carbon and also engage with our supply chain on sustainability and net zero issues. So in terms of a kind of focus on how we're addressing those targets internally when it comes to the buildings that we occupy, I'm going to talk about the Better Buildings Toolkit, which we have developed internally. So this is a toolkit that's available to all of our internal stakeholders and when relevant and appropriate, also available to external partners on a project-specific basis. And it's not mandatory, but we do strongly encourage our real estate kind of teams to use it to help embed those sustainability topics and help us meet our public goals. So the toolkit guides our internal project teams through 4 different modules, we call it. So we have a fit out module, an operations module, a lease end module, and we are in the process of developing a new construction module for those rare occasions where we are building a building, as I say, very unusual. And we think that's a fairly comprehensive breakdown of the real estate cycle as experienced by an occupier organisation. So it does have a very strong focus on net zero topics, so fossil fuel avoidance and phase out, energy efficiency, all the good stuff that Matthew talked about at the beginning, but it does cover many other topics as well, as you'd expect from a holistic sustainability policy. As part of that, we do refer to external certifications such as LEED and WELL and BREEAM, but we recognise that with a global reach, those kinds of certifications aren't always relevant, appropriate, achievable for different projects in different locations. So we give flexibility on that topic. I think one of the things that I really like about the toolkit is that because it takes all of our users through a project step by step, and it makes clear at each step who should be responsible for what aspects of embedding sustainability and net zero considerations into that project, I think it makes it very, very clear for our teams. So an example of that is in the fit out module, we start with a site assessment tool, which encourages our real estate teams to embed sustainability into the decision-making process at the point of choosing a base building. And it considers not only the base building itself, but also its location, for example. So, for example, consideration of active or public transport accessibility and any local nature impacts, topics like that. We get that embedded in the decision-making process before we even get to, for example, appointing a design team. And another example of that would be that we look to industry best practice. So when we're negotiating with landlords, once we've done that site selection piece, we look to the Better Buildings Partnership and their Green Lease Toolkit for support on making sure that we have the relevant sustainability topics for a site appropriately addressed in our lease. I'm not going to talk much more about it now, but I hope that you've got a bit of a flavour of what our internal approach is and how our toolkit works. And of course, it is part of a much larger process. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions to discuss, but I'm going to stop and leave it there. So thank you very much, and hand back to you, Matt.
Wonderful. Thank you, Eleanor, for a very brief introduction to the Better Buildings Toolkit. We'll absolutely come back to that when we get into our discussion. But if I could now please pass over to Sophia.
Hi everyone, Sophia Key here from WSP. I'm head of Future Ready here in the Middle East. So Future Ready is our global innovation program that's unique to WSP. This allows us to see the future more clearly, to challenge the brief of our clients, advise for this future as well as today, and it really sets us apart with what we're doing in the region and globally. Our Future Ready program is based around our 4 main pillars, which is climate. So looking into climatic challenges and projections for the next 50 to 100 years, which I would say is the average life cycle of an asset. You know, we need our assets to be fit for purpose and adaptable to that upcoming climate conditions. We also look at resource availability. So this is everything from food, water, air quality, biodiversity, energy, all the way up to the next 100 years, because we understand an asset we design and build today may not necessarily have the same resources in the future. We also look into society. This is many different trends based on shifts in aging population, it shifts in the number of people moving to cities, particularly in the Middle East. We're a very growing region in terms of urban expansion. We also look into additional requirements for people that are using our spaces, such as design for hidden disabilities, neurodiversity. And then also we look into technology, which is the technology that supports our assets in terms of smart, looking at cybersecurity, looking at intelligent monitoring, and then looking at modern methods of construction. So next slide, please. So as a business, we've committed to halving our embodied carbon in our design advice by 2030. So for each project, we look at a tailored trend rose for Future Ready, which allows us to identify those trends that are most pertinent for the project, rather than using the typical green building certification where we're following an international trend certification basis. We look in a tailored approach for each project location, client aspirations, and also building typology. I'm lucky enough to be within the Properties and Buildings division for WSP in the Middle East. Within our division, we have multiple specialists and engineers within our collaborative team. So I first looked at reducing embodied carbon by looking at all of the aspects that are within a building. So over 65% of our embodied carbon is actually within the superstructure and the structure. I then quantified the facade accounts for around 16% and MEP accounts for 15%. So by upskilling our teams and developing AI and digital tools, it allows us to look into a quantifiable number in order to create benchmarking and reduction. In the Middle East, we don't have current LETI guidelines or carbon benchmarking tools. So this is an exercise as a business we are doing ourselves. I just want to quickly explain the embodied decarbonisation hierarchy and our workflow. Our first step is to build less. Obviously, with less materials, we have less embodied carbon. We're coming up to a phase in Dubai's history where a lot of our buildings are coming to the end of their service life cycle. So we always look at retrofit and adaptation and refurbishment first, looking at existing materials. Any new buildings that we are designing, we look at ensuring that they're adaptable in terms of multifunctional spaces and adaptable change of use aspects embedded in concept design, because we believe that the reuse of buildings is the future of decarbonisation. It's truly the key to unlocking reduced carbon within our built environment on a whole life cycle scale. We then look at building light. minimizing dead loads, challenging the geometry. We use a number of AI and digital tools to help us look at optimizing spacing of columns, materials that will be build-ups for our facades, and also the MEP runs and ducts and the serviced equipment that we specify within a building. We then build wise, we look at repetition, we look at maximizing the utilization of similar aspects and geometries, and then we challenge the geometry. Then we look onto embodied carbon materials. We have a great benchmarking database where we look at comparisons and guide our clients in choosing between multiple options, not just in terms of the cost or the strength or the appearance of a system, but also the fourth pillar, which is the embodied carbon, which is also a decision point for our clients as well. And then we again look into this building for the future. For example, if we're designing a car park space, we know potentially in 20 to 30 years, we won't need as many car parking spaces anymore. We may need to look at adapting some of those spaces into retail units or some interesting office spaces. So we embed that within our design so that our buildings can adapt to future conditions whilst minimizing the amount of material needed for changes. And then, as I said, we build collaboratively. I'm lucky enough to be within a fantastic engineering team and specialist team where we all work together under the same roof. So at very early stages, we have key design team members and net zero leads working on our projects. And then finally, our operational decarbonisation hierarchy. This is a workflow we've been typically using a lot more before now. Obviously looking into reducing the amount of energy that we need, energy modelling, building performance analysis, supplying clean energy, looking at renewable energy sources, and then offsetting those. Next slide, please. This is an example of some of the work that we have done with an existing building. We had some structure that was an asset that was abandoned, I would say. It was no longer fit for purpose. We had 23 or 22 stories that we managed to, again, by using our specialist structural team on site, doing the health checks required for the structure system, we managed to adapt that 22-story building into a 124-story building by the reuse of structure. So I always like to emote my clients when I'm presenting these findings, and we have included some interesting aspects to look at reductions here. We've included the number of seedlings grown for 10 years, the equivalent of cutting meat and dairy from your diet for 1 year, and the equivalent of people stopping driving for 1 year, because we feel when we see these, you know, the avoided emission equivalencies in a more emotive way, it really helps us kind of drive that picture and that story as to why we want to be looking at this alternative way of working and why it's the best way in the region for us. Thank you so much. I look forward to answering a few more questions as we move through the panel.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sophia. And finally, if we can come to Tessa.
Thanks, Matthew. So wonderful to be here today. Thanks for the introduction. And I echo the observation around being on such an esteemed panel. Lovely to be talking about this important topic. So my name is Tessa Brunette. I am speaking about a case study on a master planning project in South Africa. I work at Arup, which is a multidisciplinary built environment consultant, and we focus on sustainable development. We are based in over 30 countries across the world, but I'll be specifically talking about this project delivered in South Africa as a collaboration between South African and UK-based teams. This really allowed us to leverage an understanding of the contextual considerations alongside our global awareness, and working so intimately with carbon and really designing with carbon across the world. So in 2021, we were engaged to provide an integrated sustainable infrastructure master plan for a large mixed-use development in South Africa. At the same time, we were speaking with the Green Building Council of South Africa around embodied carbon. We were carrying out our own research into carbon factors for 4 materials in 5 African countries. And we were also engaging with our institutional commitments to assess whole life carbon for each and every one of our building projects across the world that we made at COP26 in 2022. So this particular commission study must be seen within the context of our global activities, obviously through the lens of our South African team and our South African project. So within this wider context, what this master planning project allowed us to do was the opportunity to work with the client and wider design teams to establish an approach to decarbonization that allows for informed decisions to be made that result in real life improvements. What we did is we created a basis of design to enable design teams to focus on a process that would inform their designs and then result in better data that could be used to build, again, better data points within this data scarce context, all within the framework of decarbonization to meet this project's contribution to the 1.5 degree limit, which is so crucial for all of us. We also carried out a whole life carbon assessment for the whole development, which is quite amongst the first on the continent, I think, to be done for that scale, 33-hectare development. And from that, identified focus areas and carbon hotspots that really, the purpose of that was to, again, inform the focus from the various design teams so that they didn't get distracted by all the opportunities for distraction that there are and focus on the real carbon hotspots. And finally, to close the carbon life loop, we also created a responsible offsetting strategy and an internal carbon price so that we could guide how the client could then tackle residual emissions that would come through that development. So the South African context in terms of carbon is data scarce. There's also a lack of confidence about carbon assessment and a lot of confusion and distraction with lots of tools that are available. For this reason, the GBCSA, or the Green Building Council of South Africa, is also updating its own guidance and framework for net zero assessment and certification, which, as I mentioned, we're working with them specifically on the embodied carbon aspect. What working on these 2 projects at the same time allowed us to do was a really constructive checking in on scale and process, specifically thinking about how we use an approach to inform better design decisions that are ultimately delivered. And so working on a project as a design team and then also at the same time working with the GBCSA to design an assessment framework was a really constructive process, as I mentioned, for those 2 reasons, seeing it from 2 sides. So within this data scarce context, our focus for both of these studies was on confirming good enough data points that would release the tension about a lack of data, alongside a robust enough method to create the space for design teams to focus on making design decisions that reduce whole life carbon instead of just focusing on assessment and numbers. So I'll just summarize in 2 key points, I hope, the key takeaways from this process. So the first one is really about understanding and focusing on the basics. What that means is we all need to educate ourselves around carbon literacy, but not get too complicated with it. We should be using a standard approach for consistency and considering the scale of the challenge that we have. That is a globally consistent approach, and we refer to RICS, for instance, as that method. Equally, we mustn't get distracted by tools. Carbon assessment can be as simple as a hand calculation. So long as a better design decision is made, the number will never be perfect. So we really must focus on the decision that we're enabling. Then the second one is around starting at the beginning. So we achieve the biggest carbon reduction through informed design decisions. And what that means, or part of what that means, is not focusing, for instance, on material selection in stages 1 and 2. That comes later. What we need to look at in stages 1 and 2 at the beginning of a project are more fundamental decisions about structure and facade and massing. And then we progress, which talks very much, Sophia, to that hierarchy as well that you were talking about on your project. So in closing, challenges remain. I mean, we certainly haven't solved anything, and this is just the beginning on this journey, and this forum also provides a really helpful and important platform. The biggest challenge, I think, within a South African context and sub-Saharan context is certainly in communicating value to clients. The regulatory environment is not likely to catch up with the global, with how some countries around the world have established quite robust frameworks around carbon assessment. And considering the amount of development that's needed within a sub-Saharan context, the timeframes don't align. So really it's up to us to be driving this change through making the value real on all of our projects. So we really need to be collaborating across industry. So that means from clients to supply chains to every single one of us as designers. So many of the data gaps will need supply chain partners to be stepping up, design teams need to be asking, and clients need to be compelling. And in time, this will become a value proposition. But for right now, we all need to be early adopters, to be leading the way and innovating. And again, we need to be focusing on the easy wins that have the big impacts first. Thanks.
Wonderful. Sorry, pardon me. Thank you, Tessa. Right, we're going to get into this a bit more and hopefully delve into all of these brief case studies that we've heard of. Before we do, I just want to encourage our audience to, if you have not already done so, to find the Q&A function in Zoom, and please do share any questions you would like to put to our panelists, and I'll try to work them in throughout this discussion and towards the end. But hopefully what our audience have started to see now from our panelists is we've seen quite a range of perspectives here. And a narrative forming. We've had the sort of client owner occupier perspective from Eleanor and Deloitte, and how they've gone about trying to implement this internal change. We've heard about a service provider perspective from Sophia at WSP, and how they are approaching that client engagement in order to drive them to make the correct decisions at the correct points within this process. And finally, from Tessa there, we heard sort of on a quite a larger macro scale, especially in terms of urban planning, on how all of this can come together to lead to some more systemic change, especially when you're talking about that interaction with GBC SA and sort of leading that change for both South Africa and in a broader African context as well. There's lots to pick up. I'm going to come back to Eleanor first. Eleanor, it's often easy, you know, to sort of pick out key learnings when you talk about the challenges and barriers. So in relation to the toolkit, you've said it isn't mandatory for the different parts of the business to utilize the toolkit. So maybe you can talk about some of the challenges and barriers you're facing in terms of that implementation and in terms of getting more pickup within the business to deliver those reductions.
Sure. I mean, I think it's an excellent question. It kind of gets to the very heart of it. And I think it's interesting that we finished off with Tessa talking about showing the value of these things, because I'm sure it won't come to as a surprise to anybody on the call that Deloitte is a very financial value driven organization. That's, you know, of course, the basis on which the organization was established. And so definitely a challenge that we face is that for any recommendation or challenge to an existing process that you want to make within Deloitte, there's a need to build a business case for it and explain why it's appropriate and important for the business to adopt that change. But I think that people are beginning to really recognize the essential importance of sustainability and of meeting our net zero targets. And so the emphasis on financial value is beginning to lessen, which definitely helps us. It's not going to disappear anytime soon. And of course, it still has to be considered. But I think there's a recognition of the kind of existential need to engage with this properly, which is beginning to happen. But what I would say is that with that being the case, it's still true that sustainability remains a decision factor alongside the needs of the business. And so I think what helps us most in overcoming those challenges is very simply relationship building. And so I think the value that my team really brings to the organization is that we are, as we embed further and further into the organization and the Deloitte network, we're building those person-to-person relationships with decision makers in different parts of the organization. And that means that for them, sustainability issues aren't any longer a kind of far-off thing which they sort of know is important, but they don't really understand how to include it in their decision-making process. They now understand who they can talk to about things and demystify it, and therefore it becomes much more aligned and embedded within existing processes. So I think the key thing really is that building relationships, building momentum, building credibility, and one of the things that we do internally to support that, for example, is collecting examples of where the toolkit has been used and it's led to positive outcomes, and sharing those internally in knowledge sharing kind of webinars, and we call them summits internally. Everyone has their own words for these things in their own organizations. But I think that just people feel then less alone in trying to make better decisions, because they understand that the challenges they face are common challenges, and putting your hand up and saying, I sort of want to do the right thing, but I don't know how, is actually the first step in the right direction. And if everybody did that, then we would move much more rapidly in the right direction. So I think, yeah, relationships is really, really key.
100%, and I think we'll definitely come back to that. Before I move on, Eleanor, you mentioned there about how building those relationships can lead to those outcomes. Could you touch on sort of a specific example of the toolkit resulting in emissions reductions? Could you give an example, from the business about that outcome that might have occurred?
Sure. I mean, I think rather than getting too specific, I think it's probably better to say that it's been adopted in the UK firm of the business for a couple of years now, and it's now become a completely standard approach within the UK business, which means that if you see anything in the media about new office spaces that Deloitte is moving into, you'll immediately see a kind of list of sustainability certifications, yes, but also specific appropriate interventions in those spaces which have arisen from, I'm not taking full credit for it from my team, but in part through use of the toolkit, meaning that sustainability considerations were in hand in every part. And so examples like engaging with our furniture supply chain to use more and more recycled products. And I think our kind of approach to furniture procurement has changed quite significantly over the last few years because of that. So that's, I think, something that's really exciting. And yeah, hopefully that's enough of an answer for you, Matt.
No, excellent. And I think so let's build on that. You spoke about the relationships, and obviously, as more potentially the client side of things, you have to engage with other stakeholders throughout the sort of industry to deliver that. And so maybe Sophia, on to you, and you took us through some of WSP's approach. You obviously have to engage with clients such as Deloitte, but obviously others. And you spoke a little bit in your introduction about an example specifically around retrofit and reuse of an asset, and bringing it back to also what Tessa said about communicating this value to clients. Maybe you can delve a bit more. How did you approach that with the client? Were you the ones who approached them with the idea of reusing a building, or did they come to you? How did that play out?
This is a really good question, because it gives me an opportunity to toot the horn of my fantastic company. I believe we were the best technical engineers that were able to go in and look at a structure that had been left since 2009 and assess its viability for not only use of that structure, but expansion for a further 100 stories above it. And this takes a lot of technical expertise in terms of surveying, testing, on the site work, in order to not only look at what parts of the structure were still usable, but also which parts of the structure that we could remove to create a change of use of the actual type of building. It wasn't designed to be that asset type when it was first built. So, we had to remove structure, we had to take back a lot of the edge lines of the slabs to account for a 120-story facade. So I think a lot of it comes down to technical expertise. I can see why it would be much easier and simpler to just knock something down and start again. And I think obviously the future of our industry and the net zero targets for 2030 and 2050 rely on us being able to have the technical expertise to take an existing asset, survey it, work out what's still usable, work out what change of use can occur, and all of the, all of the design measures that are required to change the use of an asset. It's not just architectural design and what looks beautiful, it's all of those functionality aspects, the fire life safety strategy, the lift core strategy, the facade, replacing all of those elements. So I really think for us, we're in a very strong position to look at existing assets that are failing. But also, I think because we have the on-site delivery experience, we're able to embed those lessons learned into all of our new building designs. I think it's so important, and I always speak to our site delivery people and say, look, if we were designing from the beginning, which we are doing for a number of other buildings in the Middle East, because it's a very growing market. If you were designing from the very beginning and you knew in 20 years' time we need to remove that facade from the structure, what would we do differently? And it's an excellent question. It gets a lot of talks around kind of the best systems, the best ways of designing for deconstructibility. This is completely a new way of thinking. We've never designed buildings in a way that we have to think about taking them apart. And it was very interesting for the Expo 2020 in Dubai. We had a number of pavilions, country pavilions, that were being constructed just for a 6-month period. They had commitments from each of their country to take 90% of that asset back to their home country or to recycle or reuse it. And that was a real shift in the industry, because we're thinking about how to take a structure apart that we would usually be designing to 80 to 100 years. So I think obviously with this way of working, it's a shift from the way that we've always worked, particularly in engineering, where we're thinking about longevity, but actually shifting into a flexibility and adaptability point of view. So what's really key for us is we are a Middle East business, but we are a truly global business. I draw on lessons learned from my London team, my Asia Pacific teams, and we really do collaborate together, because we don't want to reinvent the wheel with net zero in the Middle East, especially when we've been working to LETI targets and other aspirations within other regions that have been successfully delivered. I would definitely say that as a sector, we need to have a look at embedding more of these baselines on a global outreach. I know in the UK we have the LETI guidelines, as we were just discussing, but I think the key for decarbonisation, because we are working on such a global platform now. You could be working in London and designing a building in Riyadh, for example. The key to decarbonisation is to have a look at some regional benchmarking as an overall sector, rather than individual private companies doing that work. I think that's where our biggest opportunity is in the region, as well as having data on materials. Embodied carbon values is very important. That's where a lot of our research time has been. And we were lucky enough to have leadership team that support these research and innovation tasks within the business to support the growth of decarbonisation in the Middle East.
Excellent, thanks, Sophia. I think data is obviously a massive topic. We don't have 4 hours to go through it today, but I think bringing that back across, Tessa, you referenced this challenge around data. It's applicable at all scales. Whether you are the client, whether you are the service provider, all the way through from individual spaces through to whole assets through to master planning. Maybe you can expand on that a little bit more in terms of the challenge, data as both a challenge and a barrier to what you're trying to achieve, but also, how the efforts that you've been pursuing within South Africa to sort of unlock that.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I think data is crucial, because we need data to make decisions. So it absolutely is the foundation. I think the biggest challenge that I've seen within the South African and African context is a hyper focus on having perfect data. Perfect data is not going to exist. And we need to be, I think, quite pragmatic about that. Within the lens of certainly myself as a designer and the teams that I lead as being designers on projects and informing the design of projects, the most important thing is making better decisions. And we need to be quite aware of what that one data point means in the context of the entire project. So if having, for instance, the EPD data for one particular material that constitutes 0.25% of the embodied carbon in a project, we need to make an assessment of if that data point is the most important data point to be focusing on, or do we choose to invest our energies on, for instance, informing a more efficient structural design, assessing primary structure that could reduce, for instance, the overall primary structure embodied carbon by 20%. So we're talking about systemic changes that is informed by data, but not being hung up and creating a barrier for ourselves by trying to create perfect data. So equally, I think that it's important to have good data, but it's a process to get there. And I think that that process is also something that Sophia mentioned in terms of how we learn from every project that we're working on and do the next one better and better and better. That's exactly what I think we need to be doing with data. Every single project that we have an opportunity to take from design through to completion, that completion data is like gold dust. So we need to make sure that with all of the data, the real life EPDs, the real life carbon factors, the specific materials used on that project in that location, we need to be gathering that and pulling that together and collaboratively sharing that. And I think within the World Green Building Council and your member global GBCs are a fantastic mechanism for this sharing. And I know that that's something that's very important to the World Green Building Council in terms of like understanding what role you guys could have in terms of providing and facilitating that global sharing of data so that we can use our local expertise and our local hyperlocal understanding, but collaboratively work together globally for the better outcome. And then I think the second aspect, or the second part of your question, was how were we acting on this project to get over the data or with regards to data? Yeah, so within both of those studies, the case studies that I referenced there, what we really were doing was the approach that we took was to provide data points that we know are robust enough so that designers could get on with designing and build into the governance of the project and the governance of that for the framework certification, this process of designing and getting the best outcome from the design and then gathering the data at the end and then using that data to inform the next project. So it was very much about trying to embed this iterative, constantly improving process into all of our projects and to all of our processes, again, so that we can achieve what's needed to be achieved at the scale and speed that's necessary, because we all have to be acting now, not in 10 or 20 years' time when we all have perfect data points.
Yeah, excellent, Tessa. I think that scale and speed point is something to really reinforce in terms of taking the action now rather than waiting. And I think what you've spoken about here in terms of, it's not all about the perfect data points, and it's often about the process. It's the decision making speaks a little bit towards, what Eleanor has described in terms of the toolkit. That is a way for, and Eleanor, I hope I'm not misrepresenting this, but for Deloitte to take those decisions, to put in place a process so that people can follow that to make decisions that are resulting in the necessary reductions that we want to see now rather than later down the line if that didn't exist. And probably the same for you, Sophia, in terms of what you outlined with WSP's future ready work there as well, in terms of setting out those clear steps to take those decisions. Okay, I'm conscious of please go ahead.
I just wanted to jump in because I think that some of what Tessa said really resonated around using data as the tool that it is and it not becoming the be all and end all. And I think that we're in a situation where we're in an increasingly reporting heavy environment in sustainability. And that emphasis on reporting is leading to an emphasis on time spent on getting numbers to publish, rather than time spent on, as you say, Tessa, actually learning from the flawed data that we have to make better decisions. And that is something that does worry me, because I think, you know, the number of people who spend their careers and their time working on sustainability is ever growing, which is fantastic, but it is still a limited pool of person hours that we have to help us make the transition. And so I have a concern that at the moment, maybe we're moving towards too many of those person hours being spent reporting and not enough of them being spent improving things. So I just like to throw a little bit of a controversial statement in there to spark some discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to that a little bit actually. We needed to start somewhere. In order to make reductions, we had to kind of look at what numbers we were already on. And I think that is just based on the lack of a regional carbon benchline measurement. But yes, I 100% feel that for our engineers, it distracts from the actual task at hand, which is designing really great lean buildings. So yeah, it's just getting that balance right in terms of just understanding where you are, because we can't make reductions unless we can show a reduction against something. But yeah, I think, as you say, this the quantification of carbon can sometimes get in the way of the compelling conversations and the discussions around why we are choosing particular options and that kind of thing. So I agree as well.
And then from my side, I think it's so interesting in hindsight as well. It's easier to have an opinion because, as I mentioned, we started on these two projects in 2021, and now it's 2024. It feels like a lifetime ago. But I cannot tell you the amount that myself and each of my colleagues and equally our collaborating clients and design teams have learned along the way. So, you know, I think the risk with carbon is that, and whole life carbon assessment, is that it's easy when you know how, but you have to know enough. And that journey is not the easiest one, but you actually have to invest in it and you have to commit to it so that you can get to the point at which you know enough. And then when you know enough, that's the point at which you start being able to actually act and make the decisions that are impactful and spend your energy in the most impactful place and your time, your precious time, to Eleanor's point. So you know, like I've seen some of the comments around our own Arup journey in terms of our analysis and how I think one of the questions asks around that, the comment I made around our commitment to assess our whole life carbon for all of the buildings that we're designing from COP26. And in essence, that's a hard journey, right? We as an organization, we made that decision because it's important to us and we committed to it. And we started assessing and we pulled all the data in from all our projects and got our design teams involved and everyone got involved. And we found some interesting stuff out from the end of that, or from that initial study. But every single, like at the moment, that's also going through its own cycle to make sure that as we're learning more, that allows us to do more and do better. Then we learn more and we do more and we do better. And it's just such an important process. And I think with this whole life carbon assessment journey, it's really important to constantly reflect on our own journey against the advice that we provide as well to our clients and decisions that we make on our projects.
Excellent. Thank you, Tessa. I think that's a really good point. You know, that reflection is something that we're doing right now, but it is something that I think World GBC more broadly encourages, all businesses to do in whatever relationship or sort of stakeholder they are across the life cycle. And I think it speaks a lot towards the collaboration point that everyone has made. If you are not a reflective client, if you are not a reflective engineer or service provider, et cetera, then we're not going to make those correct decisions that we need to see to achieve the emissions reductions. I'm going to try and incorporate some audience questions, and let's keep these relatively quick fire so we can finish on something else. But Eleanor, does Deloitte anticipate making use of the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard when it is soon to be released?
So I assume whoever asked that question was also on the webinar which immediately preceded this one, which was about the Net Zero Carbon Building Standard. Obviously, I can't commit to anything at this point, but we will be looking into participation in the pilot study if we have any appropriate sites, and we'll certainly be looking very closely at the standard, seeing if there's anything we can learn from it, seeing if there's anything we can embed, and as I say, any projects we could use it on. I would put it in the same bucket as neighbours in use, where we're aware that the neighbours in use standard can bring really, really great benefits. And so we're considering whether we have any sites appropriate for neighbours in use and whether that's applicable for us. So the answer is no commitment, but very interested.
Thanks, Eleanor. And yeah, I think in general, for everyone on the session today, if you're not familiar with the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard, to go and check it out. It might not solve everyone's problems, and it's obviously a very UK specific tool and resource that will be coming out, but it's certainly a good learning point for what we've all discussed in terms of encouraging you to be reflective, to think about those decisions and the processes that you're implementing. Tessa, quick for you. I think you covered it slightly, but one of the questions is quite specific on if there is a particular tool that you or Arup have used to obtain whole life carbon data.
Yeah, I think that I'm not sure if that's talking about our corporate commitment or our project actions, but from a corporate perspective, we have designed a tool. So that's part of this journey that I mentioned. A tool doesn't exist for that wide scale and also staged level of detail assessment, because as designers, as we progress through the design stages of our project, there's different levels of detail, and we have to be very responsive and pragmatic about what's available at each time, so that can again inform the big decisions, because that has to be the goal. I'm always a bit reticent to focus too much on the tools, because I think that there's a lot of opportunity for that to distract from the task at hand. In terms of the whole life carbon assessment that we carried out on that specific master planning project, that honestly was an Excel spreadsheet that is informed by a whole bunch of things. There are all sorts of calculations that go into that, some of which, for instance, one-click LCA offers a very nice opportunity to package up life cycle assessments of a specific material or specific system, whatever. So some of the assessments some of the outcomes come from that. Some of the outcomes come from benchmarks that are multiplied by floor area. It's very blended, I would say, in terms of that specific whole life carbon assessment, because it was at master planning scale, and also with constituent projects within that were at different levels of detail. So yeah, I think that's the best answer I can give.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, conscious of time, so I'm going to suggest we have one question from Emma, and she asked that whether each of you have any advice to a recent graduate going into this space, especially seeing 3 women on the panel. I can invite you to answer, but Emma, I would also invite you to message all of our panelists. I hope they don't mind me saying on LinkedIn, and I'm sure they can go into a bit more depth. But does anyone want to jump in there with a quick bit of advice?
I might go. Emma, be really curious and always make sure that you develop relationships with the people around you. My story is quite an interesting one. I graduated in 2009 after the big recession. And my first job out of university, I was made redundant after only 4 months, and I was very sad. But I still went to every single director within the company and said, thank you so much for my 4 months. It was fantastic. I then decided to go backpacking around China for a year and noticed the company had an office in Shanghai. I walked in that office door and I said hello, and one of those directors was in that office that day and said, I remember you, I'll give you a job. So I think obviously we are fully supported by technical expertise and excellence, but actually that's only part of the job when we want to be successful in what we're doing. It's about relationships, it's about being curious, it's about never being too old to learn. I'm nearly knocking on the door of 40 now and I'm still a student. I've been doing this for 16 years, but I'm here to learn every day. So I would say those are the three magic success points for me. Thank you.
Tessa.
Thanks, Aspi. Yeah, that resonates really strongly. I would say from my perspective, I completely agree about learning never stops, and it's really, and that's also, you know, kind of leveraging off the previous point I made as well. With hindsight, we have all the benefits of hindsight, you know, and it's wonderful to be learning and continuously learning, and also in the space that we are working, which is again, the scale and speed. You know, there's so much that's needed to happen, that has to happen within such a short time, that we while we need to make decisions on the basis of what we already know, we need to actively be searching for more things. And I also see there's another question in here around research. You know, I think pulling in the research community is absolutely crucial when we think about the necessary development, for instance, on the continent of Africa within the global decarbonization imperative. Like, there's so much interesting opportunities for research there around what does the size and shape of low carbon, dignified, equitable development look like? Like, we don't have the answers for that. What a fantastic challenge to be thinking about. Equally, bio-based materials, you know, that's something that I'm really interested in, considering all of the framework of things like fire safety and like basics of structural integrity. You know, we need to be really cognizant. Yeah, so I think a curious mind would be a really important one for me. Thanks.
I think the only thing I would add is a sense of humor, because I think we work in a space that can be really, really serious. And some days it can be, you know, quite challenging, kind of emotionally, facing down what we're all here trying to do. So I think it's really important to, on top of everything that Tessa and Sophia have said, which I couldn't agree with more, all the very sensible, profound things you said, I would just say also, you know, come in with a sense of humor and ready to have a laugh as well, because otherwise you'll end up grinding yourself down.
Wonderful. Thank you, each of you. I was going to bring that back to a question on policy, but I think that's a far more positive point to end on, Eleanor. I think a sense of humor does help everyone get through the day, and also on, as you said, the serious stuff that we're all working on, but that, you know, it helps us all achieve the sort of shared goals that we're working towards. I think that is a wrap for today's session. I would like to thank each of our wonderful panelists. So thank you, Eleanor, thank you, Sophia, thank you, Tessa, for sharing your insights, both for all of our audience and especially Emma. If you would like to ask each of our panelists more, I would suggest to get in touch. But in which case, this webinar has been part of World GBC's World Green Building Week campaign, and I would encourage you to go and find out what else is on, both globally and locally in each of your respective countries. Go on to World GBC's website, check out the events calendar, and if you haven't already done so, or you are not familiar with your local Green Building Council, do go and have a Google. You will probably have one in your country, and they are usually hosting sort of fantastic webinars, resources, all sorts of materials that are helping us all towards achieving our shared goals. So yes, thank you very much for your time today. Have a good rest of your week, and I look forward to seeing you all soon on a future World GBC webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.